morning, everyone. Welcome to our 2-minute warning global interview series, where we take a deeper dive into the energy transition that's occurring here in the Middle East as well as globally. It's 2 minutes to midnight, and we're seeing a massive push amongst all stakeholders towards decarbonization. I'm joined with our distinguished guest today, Shelly Trench, who's the Managing Director and Partner here in Dubai for BCG, Boston Consulting Group. Welcome to the show, Shelly.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. And, since I've taken on this position as a lead for climate and sustainability in the Middle East, it's very exciting how much momentum we have within the region, but also globally on the topic of sustainability, the circular economy, and more specifically on decarbonization. So excited to be here with you today because this is a great example of, bringing together purpose and business.
Well, we're happy to have you. And of course, before we go into the circular economy, I just wanted to get your quick thoughts on what we've been hearing here in the UAE over the past week or so with regards to an indication that they might set a net zero target. How viable do you think it is, and this is big for an oil producer to indicate it in that sense, but how viable do you think that would be for the UAE and other oil producing countries to reach net zero, essentially?
Look, I think it is very, very possible. I think we have the fundamentals to make the shift. If we step back, Brian, look at the fact that we are following countries like China that are already making their own net zero commitment. I think there is no reason that the UAE will not get there. What is fantastic about the UAE's starting point is that we already have moved very far in terms of making commitments when it comes to 50% clean energy by 2050. I think we also have in place 70% reduction in carbon footprint by 2050. So these goals and ambitions that we have as a nation are not by any way something that is new to us. The fact that we are very heavily dependent on the energy sector, and that we have, I would say, a significant amount of production from oil and gas does not preclude us from reaching that ambition. I think the energy sector has progressed and is progressing quite quickly. I know that the countries, the companies, more specifically, that are producing oil within this region, many of them are clients of myself, are themselves thinking through how they reduce their own emission footprint. So I think, Brian, it's positive. And the fact that we have this potential combined with, Dubai, Ras Al Khaimah, Sharjah, Abu Dhabi, all of them have their own plans in place for energy savings, water savings, renewable strategies. So I do think that we will be able to get to a net zero, not only from an emissions perspective, but really having a more healthy economy overall.
Do you think this is a good signal or would be a push for other countries in the region to follow?
Definitely. To follow, but I would not negate the fact that I do think that other countries in the region are in fact thinking about this. I do think that they may not have been public with net zero ambitions because they are still charting their path at the moment. I mean, you alluded to it already, Brian. It's going to be difficult and it's going to require investments. And we need to think through the marriage between the investments and the costs that are needed, the very aggressive economic growth ambitions that we have, and the business opportunities that will come out of, the circular economy overall.
And just shifting, as you rightly said at the end, the circular economy overall, how are you seeing progress in this space amongst energy stakeholders? Of course, it's cross-industry in terms of the model, but in terms of the uptake of the circular economy, from theory to application, are you seeing any success stories at the moment in the space?
So the short answer would be yes, there is some progress, yet it is not as fast at the moment as I would want it to be. So if I take an optimistic view, I would say that I'm hoping that we're just on the uptick where we'll see a lot of these strategies and planning coming into initiatives overall. The reality is that, and I will zone in on the energy sector in a while, the reality is that only 9% of our economy globally is considered to be circular. So that means that we are very much still in a take, make, waste type of economy, and need to push out of that. Now, what's the issue with the energy companies? When it comes to the pace of the uptake, I think there are a couple of things. Entities are struggling to define what is their starting point. When you think about it, it's a little bit different from just emissions or decarbonization only, where you're looking at one resource or one emission. Here, we're looking at all of the resources and waste streams across the company, and it's not an easy task. So what are the challenges? I would say, one, they don't know their starting point and have not invested enough to map that. Secondly, I would say that there is no mechanism or standard in place as yet for them to define what is good or poor performance on circularity overall. And then the third thing that I'm seeing quite often is that we have all of these resource strategies and environmental related strategies and decarbonization and climate strategies that, unfortunately, Brian, are being developed by different business units.
So it's in silos, essentially.
Exactly, and not fully in silos, but definitely not integrated. And I would say that is some of the challenge that we are seeing overall. The good news is that I do think that we are seeing a lot of innovation around the circular economy. We see the innovation, I would say, three different facets. Process innovation, which is the easiest for the companies. They've been innovating on process for years, but digital, decarbonization, etc. The more difficult for them is how they think about product and business model innovation. So how do they change the products that they're making? How do they influence the end consumers to be able to adapt? And I do think that we have some very good examples that are coming out. We have 𝗪𝗵𝗲𝗿𝗏 with some investments in PET recycling, and they just expanded their whole PET recycling business, and I expect it to acquire a bit more. We have, closer to home, BP and SABIC have just signed agreement, not just recently signed an agreement for their own recycling plans overall. And then we're seeing a lot of new materials. So when we talk about product innovation being developed, so this might be, Bloom with their bio-based polymers, Dow using recycled feedstock. So I think there are a lot of examples that are out there, and we will see more of that. What's interesting is that we have the combination of the energy producers investing more downstream. So they're building their petchem portfolios, and the petchem portfolio allows them to get closer to the consumer, get closer to the product. So they have a little bit more control over, I would say, circularity and how they use the materials and the feedstocks and recycle them overall.
So the downstream would be the best segment to focus on first in terms of the circular economy for the energy sector, would you say?
I would say there is no first or second. It has to be done across the business chain. It's a little bit like diversity, Brian. Every manager across the business needs to own circularity. I believe that—
And communicate so they become integrated.
Exactly, because I do think that it's a way. Circularity is a way of being, a way of working, and it has to embed its way into every business plan, every target, every product, every process that we're designing.
And you mentioned it.
Sorry,
go on.
No, I was saying that we're seeing some of the global companies. So if we look out of the energy sector, and maybe we in the energy sector can take a lead from them. But the reality is that, when we look at the IKEAs with their huge buyback programs, or Burger King with moving to reusable packaging, there are big things that are happening outside the sector, and we now need to continue on the positive initial steps that we have made. And this is why I think it's about accelerating the move to decarbonization and circularity.
Yeah, I was actually just going to ask you if there's best practices from other industries that could be applied, but I think that was a great example. You mentioned something very interesting. The first part of that was a lot of companies not understanding how to map things out, that starting point. And we do have conversation with stakeholders where it's, how do I dip my toes in this? Where do I get started? What would be your recommendation on the first steps of actually mapping this out for your organization and developing that strategy?
So I think it's really understanding so we at BCG really go to fundamentals, and we advise clients to go to fundamentals. And it's no different from you and I, Brian, when we look at our own homes and how we use resources. So what we advise is that all resource streams, all inputs and outputs in the company are mapped so that you can begin to measure circularity overall. So all of your feedstocks, everything that you're purchasing and using overall. Now, what I would then say is that this has to be put into the context of, the raw materials you're using, the design of the products, the production process itself, how things are distributed, because we cannot forget the supply chain and the impact that that has. And then I would say, finishing that whole circle, how we deal with the collection and recycling. So I think if you can, for all resource stream, map those steps that I've just gone through, that gives you a good basis or starting point overall.
And then just widening that out as well, you said this is really a cross-sector initiative in the sense of circular economy. Can you just talk about the wider benefits of whole being cross-sector? And of course, I keep going back to the UAE, they announced their circular economy policy this year, for example. But the need for multiple sectors to also collaborate in this space and the benefits that would bring.
Yeah, so I do believe there's some fundamentals that we will need to look at. One is rethinking the value chains that are underpinning our growth. And as we touched on earlier, thinking through how can we interlink them. So when we think about intersector synergies, and apply that system thinking, that's what will help us. So in the UAE, can the outputs of desalination, as an example, be used in the construction industry? Can we use technology to track life cycle of materials across all of our different free zones? And that then leads to the second point of, can we have a more orchestrated sharing economy, both for city services, but I would say for industrial goods overall, so that we are using less into our sector. And you would know as well as I do, Brian, the UAE falls behind a bit when it comes to waste reduction and valorization. So how do we champion that? We're going to have pretty soon, fingers crossed, one of the largest waste to energy plants in the world. So how can we ensure that that runs efficiently, that we have over time, and I hope that they're thinking about the carbon capture that's associated with it. I think there are many ways for us to drive that cross-industry, cross-sector circularity that you had mentioned earlier on.
Do you think digitalization will be a key element and accelerator of this? You mentioned technologies.
Most definitely, I think without a doubt, and as one example, I think the availability of smart metering, which is everywhere at the moment, smart metering infrastructure will allow us for utilities to manage utilities, for example, more effectively in high density areas, such as whether it's 𝗨𝗪𝗲𝗪, 𝗨𝗲𝗄, etc., to reduce the waste that we have overall. So I think the combination of smart metering, the algorithms that can help us predict where things are needed, because if we think about the cross-industry circularity we're just talking to, think about if we can have access to the positions of all goods and services across the UAE. And we have the algorithms that are guiding us like a control tower to know when things are needed and where they're needed. This allows us to dramatically reduce the inventory levels that we need to have on stock, reducing, again, the input resources that we need. So I think digital, yes, going to be a key enabler as it is for many other things at the moment.
And I can't wait until you have that application that shows you everything on your phone. That's space. But a big part of this, talking about innovation, digitalization, understanding as well policy around this too. It requires new skill sets. It requires attracting talent into this space that can really be the backbone of driving this forward. We think, back to the energy industry as well. What do you think can be done to better attract that talent overall to the energy sector? And I would say to the Middle East too. It seems to be kind of a challenge at the moment.
Yeah, great question. And I think this is where the optimism with me sits, Brian, because when we look at various studies that we've done here at BCG, there are a couple of things that we see that are very important as context before I answer that question. Almost a quarter of consumers today are changing their own buying habits to adapt for more environmentally conscious goods. So that tells you something about the population that we're dealing with. You know the story around investors.
It's a younger population as well overall. Okay.
Exactly. And what we see, and we have regulations that are coming into play. So the momentum is there. Over, I think 125 countries already have, single-use restrictions on single-use plastics. So what do we see? When we did our study, we saw that 30% of millennials, so the younger population that left the job, left because they did not feel that sense of purpose with the company. And a lot of that was related to a lack of link to broader sustainability goals, to the broader ESG agenda. So what can we be doing in the energy industry to attract more? I would say, number one, communicate. We are already doing a lot as the energy sector. One, in terms of the transition itself towards renewables, green goods, investments that we're making as companies to get towards net zero in forestry and so on. So first of all, I think we need to communicate what is being done so that we can better manage the reputation, the brand, and the perception of the sector. That is the big elephant in the room before anything else.
I do feel the energy sector struggles to communicate that, or there's some, I wouldn't say a sense of fear to put yourself out there, but
yes,
get those.
Because we have not been good at simultaneously acknowledging that we are both part of the problem and the solution. Exactly. And as we move towards the solution, there is no way to ignore the fact that we will continue to produce oil and gas because the economies around the world depend on it. And in many situations, gas is going to be needed for a very long time. Like, the transition is not quick. So I think that's very uncomfortable for a lot of people to deal with. So back to your question, the first thing I would say is that we have to communicate. The second is that we then need to more aggressively pursue the sustainability, climate, ESG, and decarbonization goals. The better that we can do at delivering on our commitments and communicating these commitments, I think that in itself will speak wonders to that target population. And not only will it speak wonders, the fact is that we will need more people to work on those environmental topics more quickly. And then that in itself becomes a magnet for new talent. I think we need to, and many of my clients would tell me for saying this, but we need to shed some of the old guard, and we need some fresh, new, young talent leading the sector and being the face of the sector. The reality is that we have the stereotypical leaders quite often saying the stereotypical things, and that's not necessarily representative of the reality of the energy sector. And I think if we can embrace the diverse portfolio that we have become as an energy company and the diverse employee population that we have become, and represent that more accurately in the public space, that we will create value for everyone.
Yeah, the baby boomers are still keeping things linear at the moment, but seems like 20 minutes goes by pretty fast, so we're just coming to the end. And as tradition, we typically ask your over the horizon view of what you think's next. But I'd like to kind of reverse that a bit and instead focus more on the immediate, in a sense that, over the next year, what signals are you really looking for that's showing acceleration in the circular economy? What points of time this year that you're monitoring? We have COP26 coming up.
Yeah.
We're coming out of hopefully a recovery from COVID-19 on global green recovery. What are you really looking at this year to see that switch get turned a little bit more to the right direction?
Great question. I would answer it in 2 words: acceleration and diffusion. So what I'm looking for is to see, are we going to have an acceleration in net zero commitments? So Brian, will the UAE make a commitment, as you mentioned? And which are the other countries that will make those commitments? Because we've seen a significant percentage of emissions being covered by these net zero commitments. So for acceleration, I'm looking at net zero commitments. I'm looking at the growth in the carbon pricing initiatives and schemes overall. So I'm looking at things like the Green Deal, the EU carbon border adjustment mechanisms. So the acceleration of these mechanisms and commitments is number 1. And then number 2 is, how are we working together globally? So which is the second point in diffusion. So, when we look at trading systems, global policies, what movement are there in those and in the joint targets as we sit together in forums like COP? But I will say that I am optimistic because I think that the new generation is demanding something that is different, and that has been followed by the actions of investors and shareholders. The change is happening. We now need to accelerate.
Yeah, I think we're starting to see more messages from Greta come out recently as well. She kind of put Scotland on the spot a little bit. But thank you very much, Shelly, for your time. As always, we appreciate your insights. And for those who are watching right now, feel free to follow Shelly on social media for further updates in the space. And of course, Gulf Intelligence, where this interview will be published on social media, and you can follow our other wider initiatives, the Energy Transition Dialogues. But thank you very much, Shelly. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Brian. Good to be with you again.